and students really kind of fact checking and being able to be good consumers of the information they receive. If you all could put yourselves on mute as you come in. Um, so I just want to welcome you this morning. We got some great input from both ELA and social studies. So we decided to combine this session to give you all a little bit of a deeper dive as you plan around providing these types of things for students and access for students on ways they can judge the information that they're receiving and some other things in their platform. So this morning we have Mr. John Silva, Kim Boehm, and Jordan Mays from the News Literacy Project to give you some additional information. And I'm sure they're going to offer you opportunities for questions. And for those of you all that have started using the platform that may have some additional questions. And also they put in the chat a Google Doc for you to go ahead as an additional attendance form. Just for some quick housekeeping, all of the previous PDs, I'm adding the participants based on Zoom login information. So rather than sending out, because some of you all said you kind of forgot, because it does go kind of back. We talked about how they just approved all the sessions that we've been having. So instead of stressing you guys out about the previous ones, I just pulled the Zoom reports for logins and giving credit. And just as a quick housekeeping rule, I know that we've had some technology issues with everyone being on our Zoom platform on one day and being at home and our Wi-Fi. But moving forward, with the Zoom, if it just shows you've been there for 2 minutes, I kind of can't give you the full hour credit. So just be mindful. And if you're kicked out, try to log back in and try your best to stay for the entire time. But again, welcome and good morning. Always good to see everyone's happy faces in the morning. Thank you all for those that can show your camera. And I'm going to turn it over to the News Literacy Project group to start their presentation.
Beautiful. Thank you, Dr. Williams. Hi, everybody. I might have met you before in our Checkology session. I'm Jordan from the News Literacy Project, and I'm joined by my colleague, Kim. I'll turn it over to Kim to introduce herself.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Kim Bowman, and I'm the User Success Associate for the News Literacy Project. And so I'm often found in our Checkology Help Center. So if you were at our Checkology session and need any help with any questions or requests, please visit me in our Help Center. And we've got some great links for you all in a Google resource document today that we'll be posting in the chat. And I'll also be posting that attendance form. So thank you all for inviting us here today, and I'll hand it back over to Jordan.
Thank you, Kim. So this morning, we're going to spend about 50 minutes to an hour with John talking about what it means to be news literate, or an introduction to news literacy education. And then after that, we'll spend about half an hour talking about Checkology again and some of the other resources that NLP has for you to use in the classroom. So my colleague John has been with NLP for about 4 years now, and he heads up our training and professional development team. This is after a 13-year career of teaching, so he has a lot of expertise to share with you today, and I will turn it over to him to talk about what it means to be news literate.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm really happy you could join us today. So the purpose of this part of our morning is going to be focusing on skills and learning objectives in the field of news literacy, which connect to the lessons that students will be doing in Checkology, but the focus is more to be thinking about, so when students go through news literacy education, when they go through Checkology, so what does it look like at the end? So what is it that we want students to be able to know and be able to do? So a lot of the ways that I'm going to be framing this are sort of in terms of learning objectives and outcomes. So I am part of the education team at the News Literacy Project. I do a lot of, my primary focus is on professional learning and developing resources. But I do also spend a good deal of my time researching misinformation, and more recently doing a lot of work in the field of conspiracy theories and conspiratorial thinking, which, as many of us are aware, has become has been really increasing as a problematic issue, especially in the last several months to a year. So I do a lot of work on that. And yes, I was a classroom teacher for 13 years. If you'd like to reach out to me directly after this morning's session, my email address is there in the lower left of your screen. Please feel free to email me directly. And if you're active on social media, like all of our accounts, I do share a lot of resources and information relating to news literacy and misinformation and conspiracy theories on my Twitter account. So that's my handle right there. So one of the things that is really essential to the work that we do on the education team at the News Literacy Project is working towards this understanding that news literacy education is a right. It's not really something that we consider to be optional. And that's for several really important reasons. When we talk about civics and civic education and civic participation and what it is that we want our students to be able to do when they become adults and active in their communities, being able to understand, recognize, and act on reliable information is the absolute foundation for every decision that we make, especially those things about the things that are happening in our communities and how we're going to participate in the civic life of our communities. And when we look at the amount of information that's out there, when we look at how much we are able to interact, how much we have access to, how complicated it is, but also in so many ways how empowering it is, it can be overwhelming because students are growing up right now in this complex information landscape. And the reality is that while they are comfortable using technology, they're not really the digital natives that we often perceive them to be, right? They know how to use different types of technologies and services, but they don't really understand how they work. And so we actually have to make deliberate steps to prepare them for how to navigate all of this and how to understand what's going on. So when we talk about news literacy, I want to make sure that we all sort of have a common understanding of what we mean by that. So one of the very first aspects of news literacy is about being able to determine for ourselves whether or not information and the source of that information is credible. It sounds kind of simple on its face, but it's actually very, very complex because there's a lot of different ways that information and sources of information are misleading us, are confusing, and it can be very overwhelming. So news literacy is about determining credibility. Along with that, news literacy is also understanding where to get and prioritize information, especially about current events, that comes from news organizations and journalists who follow the standards of quality journalism, because we have to be able to trust sources so that we know what's going on, that we are informed, and we know that what information that we can act on. And then finally, one of the other things that's really important in this field is understanding that without a free press, without being able to be informed from those news organizations through the freedom of the press and being able to interact with the news and information, we would not be able to know what's going on, and we would not be able to be active participants in the civic life of our communities. So as I'm going through this, there's two very important things I just want to make sure everybody knows. First, I will make available a PDF of these slides. We'll send those out via email sometime after today's session. I will also stop at a couple of points to check in to see if there are some questions. So if you have a question, feel free to drop it in the chat and we will pause at a couple of points so that we can address those and have a conversation. So let's get into what these learning objectives look like. One of the somewhat simplest, but probably most important that we need to be teaching young people is the difference between news and opinion, and then understanding those standards of quality journalism. One of the things that's difficult about this is that it's often very difficult for adults to differentiate news from opinion. And there's a lot of important reasons for that. Most importantly, though, when we look at where we're getting our news, so many of those news organizations are very heavily skewed towards commentary and opinion, and it overwhelms what we're seeing, and it makes us feel like everything is opinion and not being able to recognize it. So this is one of the things that we want to teach young people how to recognize. The key difference is that news informs us. It's telling us the who, the what, the where, the when, and they're doing it in a way so that we know what's going on. Opinion is trying to persuade us to come around to a particular viewpoint. It's trying to tell us what to think and why, and why we should agree or disagree with something. When we look at news that informs, we have to understand that news comes from these organizations and journalists that are trying to follow these standards of quality journalism. So when we talk about the who, what, where, and when, that information has been verified by the journalist and the news organization independently. And that verification comes from multiple quality sources. Could be official sources, expert sources, or documentation, etc. But there are sources that we know who they are, and we know that how they've been verified. In that news, we also see the information from a perspective of fairness, that multiple viewpoints, for example, are presented. So if a news story is being critical of a government official, that government official should have an opportunity to respond, and their voice is in that story, so we know what they're saying. When we're reading about an event, necessary background and contextual information is provided so that we really understand things that are happening. And then in the reporting, in the publishing of the news, these news organizations are following these standards of accountability and transparency, in the sense that if they make a mistake, they issue a correction, no matter how minor. The reputable news organizations will issue a correction. And they're transparent not only in their methodologies and how they do their work, but they're also transparent to their relationship with the subject matter. So for example, anytime the Washington Post is reporting on Amazon, every time they will mention that the Washington Post is owned by Jeff Bezos, who also owns Amazon. So that transparency in the way they work and the relationships is really important. When we're talking about recognizing opinion, in many ways, it's the absence of a lot of those things that we look for in news. Opinion is usually labeled in some way, especially by reputable news organizations. We look for those keywords. The tone and the writing of opinion pieces is very different. Opinion pieces will be written in the first person, and will use different types of persuasive language techniques, and looking at the tone. So it's very, very different. So we need to make sure that students can recognize these two different main types of information, because it's really important, because it drives so much of how we perceive the news and the media. Because for example, a lot of our perceptions about, conservative outlets versus liberal outlets is based off of the commentary and not so much about the straight news. So one of the resources that we have that I really want to mention here, talking about news and the field of journalism, we have this is a simple form that you can fill out. It's called Ask a Journalist. So the bit.ly is there on the screen. So two of my colleagues, Susanna Gonzalez and Hannah Covington, are professional journalists who have joined the education team at NLP. If you have questions about journalism, about the field, about the things that they do, you could submit a question there, and they will try to answer it themselves, or try to find someone else that could help answer the question. And some of them will be featured in our newsletter this SIFT. So this is something that you could ask, or maybe your students can also ask. And then just a quick sort of plug here, if we're connecting to Checkology, the initial lesson on info zones talks about news and opinion, as well as several other zones of information. And if you want to reinforce about the standards, our practicing quality journalism lesson is also in there, which is the simulation activity, where students take on the role of a reporter, investigating and reporting on a simulated accident. The next sort of field that we want to get into to talk to young people is about misinformation. Right, so if news is about understanding things that are happening and the things that have been verified, misinformation is the opposite of that. So one of the things that I want to sort of mention about we need to define what misinformation is, because in some cases there's a lot of confusion. So when you look up a definition of misinformation, these are some of the keywords that you will frequently find in dictionary definitions, right? But this is how that we define it at the News Literacy Project, that it's false or misleading information that is created and or shared regardless of intent to deceive. And intent is actually really important in understanding the different types of misinformation, because intent can actually make discussions of misinformation far more complicated. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, but it's really important because we have to understand that misinformation very broadly is any information that's false or it's simply or misleading. And so misinformation is a very broad term. And one of the things that we see a lot is people using misinformation and disinformation interchangeably, and they're actually very different. So where misinformation is anything that's false or misleading, disinformation is false or misleading, but there is a deliberate intent behind it. Disinformation is something that was knowingly created and shared to deceive us. Now, what's interesting is that the term misinformation has been around since 1605. It was actually used for the very first time in a book of poetry called The Poor Man's Passions by Arthur Warren. This is what I do. This is how I do research. So the term misinformation has been around for over 400 years. The first time disinformation was used was in 1939, describing Nazi sort of propaganda activities, but actually didn't really become popularized or really commonly used until the Cold War, when it was used to describe efforts by the KGB in the Soviet Union, these deliberate disinformation campaigns. And the KGB actually had a department that was specifically for spreading disinformation. And this is something that I found very interesting to sort of understand the context here, is that this is an Ngram viewer of how these three terms have been used. And you can see that going all the way back to 1800, misinformation has been used throughout that time. But disinformation, we see the spike coming up into the 80s. And then the term fake news is actually a new phenomenon. It has really only been around since about 2013 was when it was first used. But the problem is that fake news has become this catch-all term for a lot of things that are fake. And that is very problematic, and something that we want to teach young people to stop using, is that fake news is this very politicized, very weaponized term. And it's actually become very dismissive and divisive. And so fake news is this very political term. So we want to stop using it, and we want to be more accurate in our vocabulary. So misinformation is a very broad term. As I'm about to show you, that we have some ways of differentiating and coming up with more specific terms. But one of the things that I want to mention is that when we talk about misinformation and when we look at what's out there, it often feels overwhelming. It's making us feel like we can't trust anything, and it's pushing us towards cynicism. But it's important to recognize that that's what misinformation does. Misinformation is designed to confuse us. So by breaking it down and understanding it, as I'm going to talk about it, we can actually reduce that confusion. We can reduce the cynicism, and hopefully get to a point where we might be more skeptical and critical as opposed to cynical. So we define misinformation with these 5 basic types. And what we have done is we've tried to remove intent from the analysis and looking at different ways that these types of misinformation present. So one of the first and probably most common types of misinformation out there is called manipulated content. So this image that you see here was an image that went viral a couple of weeks ago. Someone had photoshopped the dresses of Representatives Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to make it look like their dresses had a combination of the Chinese Communist Party yellow stars and swastikas. They weren't actually wearing that. So what manipulated content is, where you have someone take an original image or a document or something, and one aspect of it has been altered. Most commonly this is with images, usually using something like Photoshop. But by altering one aspect of it, we have created misinformation. So in that example, we manipulated the dress, and we changed what it looked like, and it made it look like they were wearing something that they weren't. So manipulated content is one of the most common. The second very common type of misinformation is called false context. So this image has actually made the rounds several times over the last several years, claiming that this is the USS Al Gore global warming research vessel, and it's, as you can see, it's coated in ice. And this makes the rounds, especially in social media groups and contexts that deal with climate science denial. The thing is, it's a real image. That's a real boat. It's really covered in ice, but it's not the USS Al Gore. It actually has nothing to do with that. It's actually someone's personal, private boat in a harbor in Scandinavia. So what false context is where we take something and we change its context to make a new type of misinformation. We might take a quote, change its author, change a location. We change some aspect of the context of it, and we've changed its meaning to create false information. The third, and this is what we used to call fake news, is fabricated content. So what fake news used to be was a completely made up story that was designed to look like a real news story from a real news organization, but every part of it was false. And it was created as a form of clickbait. The idea was that when you click on a link to these articles, it generates ad revenue. But that term fake news, as I mentioned, got politicized and weaponized. So now we define this as fabricated content. It's this idea that it's all made up. So this is an example of, so this is the Daily World Update. It is not a real news site. And this is actually a really interesting theme that for some reason, there's a number of these false sites that are creating these articles that suggest that Malia Obama keeps getting arrested. They're totally false, completely made up. And this is what fabricated content is. It's something that's entirely made up, but it's designed to make us think that it's real. And there's some different ways that shows up. Another one, it's related to fabricated content, but has a key difference, is imposter content. You may have seen this tweet make the rounds a few weeks ago during the sort of the very dangerous winter conditions in Texas. And when Senator Cruz made his trip to Cancun, this tweet went viral, making it look like he had said this. But the thing is, this is a completely fake tweet. It was created using either a website or an app. He never tweeted this. There's no evidence that he ever did. But when we have imposter content, it's something that has been made up, but it's using a celebrity, a politician, maybe a corporate logo or a brand. And it's using that well-known name to make us think that something is authentic when it's false. So that's imposter content. So it's that usage of a well-known name that makes it different from fabricated content. And then the last one is satire. We don't often think of satire in the context of other types of misinformation, but it's actually a really important part of the conversation. So this is a screenshot from a video posted by Blair Erskine. She's actually a comedian. She posts a lot of these funny and satirical videos. And so she posted this, pretending to be the director of communications for Senator Cruz. And as you can see, when I took the screenshot, this had gone massively viral. It was retweeted 12,000 times, 11,000 quote tweets, 66,000 likes, thousands upon thousands of comments, many of which were people believing that it was real, but not really taking the time to investigate it more. And this is where satire becomes problematic, because it has been increasingly political in the last several years, but it's very problematic because when it hits people's political beliefs in particular, people tend to believe it when they probably shouldn't. And so satire is important to understand because, it's not really intending necessarily to deceive us, but it makes other types of misinformation seem more credible. But also importantly, when people try to use satire as a form of defense, so if somebody puts something out that's false and there's pushback and people say, hey, it's not my fault you believe it, it's just satire, right? Students need to be able to recognize what satire is in this context, because people will often believe that it's true and it actually contributes to other types of political misinformation in particular. So we do have a lesson on the 5 types of misinformation in the Checkology virtual classroom. And so you can please feel free to check that out. So before I go into the next set of skills, I'm just going to pause here to see if there's some questions so far. I know that there have been some things in the in the chat. So I just want to see if there's any particular, if there's any questions. I don't see any. Okay. All right. So how do we verify information? How do we check things out? We need to be teaching students some fact-checking skills. And in particular, there are 3 that we should focus on as a starting point. And I'm going to take you through some of these examples. We're gonna use one example to sort of highlight all 3. So the first is using observation skills, just using the Mark 1 eyeball and taking a look at and just trying to see what we see. So here is one example. We highlighted this in the SIFT a few weeks ago. This tweet went viral back in January, claiming that this was a massive crowd on January 5th turning out in support of former President Trump. And so this is obviously, this is the day before, you know, the insurrection on January 6th. So I'm going to ask you to take a close look at this image. And if you would please, in the chat, what do you see in this image that might make us question whether or not this was actually taken at a Make America Great rally in Washington, D.C.? So take a close look and drop your comments in the chat about what you do or don't see. So Brett notices that there's a Canadian flag in the image, okay? Malcolm thinks it's from the Women's March. It doesn't look like DC. Don't see any red hats, right? So we don't see, if this was a Trump rally, right? There are some things that we would expect to see. There, you know, there are some things that are consistent. The red hats, we would see, you know, there would be a lot of flags, right? There would be the, you know, a lot of the blue Trump 2020 flags. There'd be American flags. There'd be a number of flags that those are very prominent in those, right? Don't see anything in the image that is specific to Washington, D.C., right? Right, no familiar landmarks. Right, we don't see the Capitol. We don't see the Washington Monument, right? No American flags. So the interesting thing is that this image was actually taken in Washington, D.C., but it was from the 2018 March for Our Lives protest. When that building where you see the Canadian flag, that's actually the Canadian Embassy in Washington, D.C. Now, one of the things that's tricky about this is actually a very important street in Washington, D.C. The difference is that usually when people take pictures on this street, they're facing 180 degrees, and if you look down the street the other direction, you see the Capitol building. So critical observation. What's important here is that when we practice critical observation, we're trying to suppress any emotional reaction we might have, and by using critical observation skills, we're engaging those critical thinking skills. So some of the things that you guys mentioned, right? This is what we want to look for: distinctive landmarks, architecture, anything that might give us a name, a phone number, maybe a license plate, things like that, landscape features. We also want to look at things like that might tell us what time of year it is. We could look at the sky, angles of shadows, you know, looking at the foliage, you know, and other things that could tell us, like maybe what time of year it is, could tell us about the climate, that could give us a sense of where it is. We also want to look at the image to see if there might be some manipulation, right? So there could be things like pixelation, weird angles, odd color changes, and things like that. So by really looking at these images, it really helps us sort of think about, okay, so what is it that I'm seeing? So the next skill that's really important in this, and this is because so much misinformation is visual, is the reverse image search. So we're just continuing with this example. So just through observation, we believe this might be false context misinformation, right? So this was claiming to be Washington, D.C. in January 2021. We don't think it is what it says it is, so we're going to investigate it further. So what a reverse image search does is it takes the pixel pattern of an image and tries to match it with other images in the search database. There are several different reverse image search websites out there. I'll show you a couple of them in a minute. There are a couple different ways that you can do it. I'm going to show you how to do search from browser, which is one of the most common types. But there are a couple of others, and there are also some mobile apps that you can use if you want to do it from your phone. So to do a reverse image search from your browser, so going to the original tweet, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my cursor over the image, and then I'm going to right click, and that's going to pop open this menu. So in this example, I'm using Google Chrome and Google as my default search engine, but all of the major browsers and search engines have this function built into it. So when I click search Google for image, it's going to upload it to Google, and Google's going to try to match it. And the very first images that pop up are for, you can see that it says March for Our Lives. So I want to make sure that I'm taking a close look at the results. I want to see if I can match the image to the one that I searched. So I can see this is what Google is telling me. I go down and it's going to show me what it calls the visually similar images. And so I compare the first one with these search results. And by looking at them, I can see that this is actually from the March for Our Lives rally. So there are 4 main websites that do reverse image searches. Some of them are better than others. The 2 that are probably that stand out are Google and Yandex. But they're better at different things. So for example, Yandex is really good at matching faces and images, where Google is sort of neutral. They both do great with structures and places. They're okay with, like, different sizes, and like if it's flipped. So Yandex is good if somebody flips an image so that it's reversed, whereas Google is not as good. Bing is okay. TinEye used to be one of the best ones out there, but they've really fallen behind on some of these. If, for example, you want to search from a video, there are some tools out there. If you want to get into some advanced things, we can share some of this with you a bit later. If we do some advanced digital forensics, there's a tool called InVid. They use keyframes, but you can take a screenshot of a video and do the same thing. If you want to do a reverse image search for your phone, there's a number of apps out there. You want to find one that will search from multiple search engines. So the one on the right is called Reverse Image Search from ThinkFree. This is one that I use on my Pixel device, which I like. It's very good. The other one on the left is called Reversey. I have a couple of colleagues who use it on their iPhones, and they find that one to be pretty effective. The third skill is called lateral reading. You may be familiar with this. Lateral reading is a term derived from research done by Sam Weinberg and Sarah McGrew at the Stanford Graduate School of Education. The idea is that what lateral reading is that as you're reading something, you're trying to verify it, and you're doing that in a different browser tab. So instead of verifying something sort of vertically, right, the idea of looking for the author, looking at the source, right, going through one of those checklists, lateral reading is trying to verify it from other sources by looking for those key details, looking for the credibility of the source, trying to find more context and background, going to multiple sources and using them so that we have a higher degree of confidence in what we're reading. To do lateral reading, you have to use some deliberate search strategies. Here is where I always emphasize the importance of engaging your librarians in this work. Librarians have been doing this type of thing for longer than most of us have, and this is something that they do very, very well, is understanding how to search and how to search through databases and other things. They've got some great resources to learn some of this. Click restraint is also important here. We want to make sure students don't just click on the first link that pops up with the results. You want to review the results. You want to be very selective in what you choose. So I'm going to apply some lateral reading to this. So the tweet comes up, and I'm going to say, okay, so how large was this crowd in Washington, D.C.? By phrasing it in the form of a question, that's actually sort of signaling to the search engine algorithm that I'm trying to verify something. These search engine algorithms are actually getting really good at prioritizing results from fact-checking organizations. So Here's how this shows up, but also why click restraint's important in reviewing the results. You can see the first 3 results are fact checks that actually talk about the fact that the image is actually from March for Our Lives. But if I go through the other results, these are all just sort of general news articles about pro-Trump rallies in Washington, D.C. in general. They don't really get to that specific image. In mentioning fact-checking organizations, I get a lot of questions about them. There are several fact-checking organizations out there, and major news organizations also do fact checks. You want to be cautious about when you get information from them, right? We want to make sure that we're using fact checks from organizations that do their work in very responsible ways, right? A good fact check will not just tell us whether or not something is true. They're telling us how and why they know. And in showing their work, they tell us what the evidence is, and we can see that evidence for ourselves. They tell us what they learned. They give us the background and context. We can see it, and it helps us understand how they reach that determination. And in their methodology, there should be some transparency, but also in terms of how they get their ratings. Because some fact-checking organizations don't just say something's true or not. Sometimes there's a spectrum, which seems weird. But we should know what the criteria is for those ratings. And when we're practicing this, we want to make sure that we're also using different fact-checking organizations whenever possible. We do go into a lot of these in the Check Center in Checkology. So we have a number of tools and tutorials that relate directly to these, but also with some of the more advanced functions. And if you're interested, please take a look at the work that they've been doing at Stanford into lateral reading and online civic reasoning. They've got some great resources, and they also have a lot of great information that relates specifically to this. And they've got some really amazing stuff that you can use also with middle schoolers. So I'll pause one more time here to see if there are some questions.
We don't have any in the chat so far, but we welcome them there if anyone would like to add.
Okay, cool. All right, so I'm going to go into a few other things that are also very important, and some of these are also about teaching habits. But one thing that's a really common thing is that we don't take time to learn the context of something before we share it. It's a really problematic behavior on social media, but it's something that we really need to be talking about. And here's an example this popped up on my Twitter feed about a month ago. This doctor posted this image, so marketing win or marketing fail. You can see that this is an ad for a teeth whitening system, right? Everyone smiles in the same language. This is no matter your accent or origin, right? And you can imagine there was some outrage to this. People were angry, people were sharing it, people were retweeting it. Because I'm actually hyper tuned to a lot of these things, I wanted to know more, so I just did a reverse image search on the ad, and the first thing that popped up that says dentist whitening ad racist. And just by doing that reverse image search, I actually learned that ad was actually from May of 2018. And when it came out, there was the outrage that you would expect, but also the fact that after the ad came out, the dental practice that published it, they issued an apology. And they have taken some steps to make sure that, that sort of insensitivity doesn't happen again. But you can imagine how often that outrage is regenerated in the years since, and will probably continue because, the internet never forgets. Somebody sees something, they don't look up the background, and they share it, and it regenerates that outrage. The outrage culture is really problematic, but it's important for us to take a step back and learn context before we give in to those emotional responses. Also related to this is talking about logic checking, right? This is something that we don't often talk enough about especially when we spend a lot of time on fact checking. We need to talk about logic checking as well. And so here's an example. So this is a set of maps that still get shared. It really went viral early in the pandemic. and it relates to the conspiracy theory that the coronavirus is being spread by 5G networks. So we have one map. The top map is from the New York Times. It's an authentic map that shows 5G rollout and 5G networks across the United States. The second is a map that plots coronavirus hotspots, and you can see that there is a correlation between the two, right? If we fact check these maps, they are accurate. They are accurate maps. The problem is that it violates one of the most fundamental logic checks, right? Correlation does not equal causation. But so a lot of misinformation and conspiracy theories take these leaps of logic and use logical fallacies to spread their false beliefs. Here's another one that came about recently after Hank Aaron died. This went out from Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's a very prominent anti-vaccine conspiracy theorist. So he tried to make this connection that Hank Aaron got the COVID vaccine, and 18 days later he died. And so he's using the death of Hank Aaron to spread his anti-vaccine propaganda. But the reality is that Hank Aaron died from other causes and had nothing to do with the Moderna vaccine. It was simply a coincidence of timing. Similarly, this was something that it's still being spread in a lot of far right-wing circles, this belief that Joe Biden isn't actually the president of the United States, that he's somehow a false president. So this was a conspiracy theory that was going around early on, the fact that President Biden had not flown on Air Force One, therefore he wasn't actually president. And when he did fly on a plane, he flew on the smaller one that's below, right? The thing is that Air Force One is not a specific aircraft. Like, we associate it with the 747 because that's the one we most often see. But actually, whatever aircraft the president flies on, that aircraft becomes Air Force One. But they're taking these leaps of logic, trying to spread these false beliefs and asking us to sort of accept the logic in a way when it's just not true. We do go into logical fallacies in our arguments and evidence lesson. We talk about these 5 key logical fallacies. But related to this is we also have to be talking about reasoning. How do we reason? How do we check to see whether or not something is believable or true? Because one of the realities is that misinformation really tries to manipulate us through our emotions and our beliefs, right? Because the things that we believe are so very important to us, we often have an emotional connection to them, and they're part of our identity. And so one of the things is that when things feel right, when they agree with us, we're actually more likely to accept them, and that makes us reinforce the beliefs. And this falls into what we call cognitive biases. So cognitive biases are just these sort of natural ways that our brains work that actually get us to interpret information in certain ways that can actually lead us to believe things that are not true or irrational. And understanding how these cognitive biases work is really important when we talk about logic checking and verifying information. So I'm going to go through some of these very quickly. One of the most common is called confirmation bias. And this is something that affects all of us in one way or another. What it simply means is that if something agrees with us, doesn't matter if it's true or not, if something agrees with us, we're actually more likely to believe it because it agrees with us and reinforces what we believe. It's very easy for us to believe something that agrees with us. And if something doesn't, then we are likely to reject it because we don't like having our beliefs challenged. So confirmation bias is a very natural thing. It happens without us even thinking about it, but it's important for us to be aware of it. Here's an extreme example from flat earth conspiracy theories, right? Somebody takes this picture, right? It's, why is it called sea level? You see the horizon, you see the reflection on the ball, right? So it's completely level here. This is proof the earth is flat. And if I believe the earth is flat, I'm going to accept it. Yes, that's proof. See, I have proof that the earth is flat. Another one that's also common that we don't often recognize it when it happens is called proportionality bias. And the interesting thing about this is that when something major happens, when there's a major event, our brains naturally believe that it must have had a major cause, right? So an example of this is the Kennedy assassination. There is a significant percentage of the American population that believes that Lee Harvey Oswald did not act alone. Part of that comes from this idea that we don't want to believe that the president of the United States was assassinated by a lone gunman in a building shooting at a distance at a moving car, right? There must be something more behind that. Right? We don't want to believe that the leader of the free world could just be assassinated by a crazy lone gunman. We saw this last Christmas. There was a number of things relating to the bombing in Nashville. This is a fake tweet that was attributed to Taylor Swift, suggesting that somehow she had some foresight knowing that was going to happen, right? It's not really comfortable for us to believe that a crazy loner living out in the middle of nowhere can pack an RV full of explosives, drive it into a city, park it downtown, and then blow it up, right? There must be something bigger behind it. So we look for some of those things. And so that's what proportionality bias is. The bigger the event, the bigger the cause must be. Somewhat related to this is intentionality bias. This is the idea that accidents don't just happen, right? There must be a cause. We don't like to think that things just happen out of nowhere, right? That can be scary, that can be anxiety producing. So when we see things happen, we look for a cause. There must be some sort of intentional act behind it. You may have noticed a few weeks ago, the term Jewish space lasers was going viral on social media after Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene made a claim about this. So there is a belief that the wildfires in California and Australia are not naturally occurring. These were actually deliberately set by direct energy weapons, either aircraft-based or space-based. And there's a couple different justifications behind it. But these wildfires in California and Australia have been massive, and in some cases have destroyed entire towns. And so people look for big causes, right? It's really scary to think that an entire town like Paradise, California can be practically wiped off the map because someone left a campfire unattended. There must be something bigger behind it. There must have been some intentional act. It couldn't have just been an accident. Another one that's very, very common is called motivated reasoning. So this is where we will go out and actually try to look for things or interpret things in a way that will reinforce something that we believe, right? So if we believe something, we want to find more evidence that will support that belief, and we will latch onto it no matter how reliable or true it is. But also through motivated reasoning, if something disagrees with us, we will find a way to either dismiss it or debunk it, or find a way to take that disproving information, turn it, reinterpret it, and make it agree with us. So I'm going to show you an example here. So there is a very weird conspiracy theory that's been around for some time, that some famous men in history were actually women, and some famous women in history were actually men. And so people will go to great lengths to try to find things. So for example, here's where somebody is trying to prove that Joseph Stalin was actually a woman. So here's one thing that it's really interesting. If you happen to look down at your fingers while I showed you that, please don't be embarrassed. It's actually completely natural. I put this in here in part to emphasize just how easy it is to suck someone into something like this, right? Your emotions can be used against you. Curiosity is an emotion. And this is something that if you look down at your hand, it's a pretty natural reaction. But I kind of emphasize this as a way to illustrate just how easily you might get sucked into something that's not true. But to get back to motivated reasoning, there is a belief that Kyle Rittenhouse, the young man from Aurora, Illinois, who is on trial for killing someone at a protest in Kenosha, Wisconsin, that he is actually a woman. So if I believe that Kyle Rittenhouse is actually female, this is what motivated reasoning looks like. I'm going to do some lateral reading. I'm going to put Kyle Rittenhouse as female in quotation marks, because I want to find anything that will have that exact phrase. And I'm going to look for anything that will reinforce this belief that Kyle Rittenhouse is female, right? And so the belief is that he's not actually a young man from Illinois. He's actually a Kenosha police officer who was undercover and was causing a lot of the riots. So that's what motivated reasoning. I'm going out and I'm looking for it. So confirmation bias and motivated reasoning look similar. The difference is that confirmation bias is a sort of passive acceptance. If something agrees with me, I'm going to take it, I'm going to use it. Whereas motivated reasoning is a more intentional effort. One of the last ones I'm going to show you is called patternicity, also called illusory pattern perception. So what this is that we're taking the natural tendency for us to see patterns and to recognize patterns. But what patternicity does is that we try to take random things, make connections to create a pattern, which will then be used as some sort of evidence to support a belief, right? I'm going to take whatever random things I can find, and I'm going to try to, in effect, manufacture evidence by creating a pattern or creating some sort of cause and effect relationship. Getting back to the wildfires, here is an example where people are taking these maps, similar to the COVID maps and 5G maps. So here we've got maps of wildfires in Australia and California. And then we have these maps that are showing proposed rail lines in California and Australia. And we're putting those together and we're saying, see, there's a connection. Clearly, these wildfires were deliberately set because we're trying to build these high-speed rail systems. We see this also with the use of gematria. Gematria is simply the idea that you take letters, you assign a numerical value to those letters or words, you use them to create a pattern, then create meaning. This is something that's very common in QAnon conspiracy theories. They're always looking for the number 17 because Q is the 17th letter of the alphabet. So here's where somebody took these random things with Representative Ocasio-Cortez, assigned some random numerical values, created this pattern, trying to say that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is actually Q from QAnon. So it's important to remember that it's actually very normal for us to see patterns and to make connections between random things. It's a totally normal thing that our brains do. Patternicity is about the creating patterns and using them to sort of justify misinformation or conspiratorial belief. So the last lesson I will mention, this is actually our newest lesson. We just launched it earlier this year on conspiratorial thinking. It will probably be a little high level for middle school students, but if you do it in a more blended environment, I believe it's one that your students would find really engaging. And then the last thing before I close out and open up for questions is that just a reminder that one of the most powerful teaching tools is and always will be modeling. This is something that you can do not only for your students, but you can also do it for friends and family and loved ones, practicing these habits for yourself, being mindful of what you share, checking things, verifying it, and being part of the effort to stand up for factual information and help us push back against misinformation. So I'm going to just pause here to see if there are some big questions.
Yes, we have 3 questions so far, but please go ahead and type more in the chat. These questions all came up during your segment about logic checking, but I think in light of your segment on conspiratorial thinking, they kind of take on a new dimension. The first question is about research. So when students are researching information, they often get broad, long, and exhaustive lists of irrelevant information. What would you recommend for narrowing the search and making it more focused to the topic at hand? In terms of research, so this is where I think if we're talking about teaching research as an academic skill, this is where it's important to talk about where we search, right? I think it's natural for students to go to Google first. And when they start searching there, they can get anything and everything. And they don't have the skills yet to be able to sort through that. I think this is where, talking to librarians and finding out like what databases might be available and teaching them how to search in
narrower databases that are focused on academic research and academic sources, or more sort of where there is some vetting about what goes into the search database. That's an important thing. But it's also important that there needs to be an intermediate step for students to understand that I find a source and I think that it's relevant to whatever it is I'm researching. I need to research that source before I look into it further myself. And this is where I taught middle school for several years, and when people ask me what it's like to teach middle schoolers, one of the ways I often describe it is that middle schoolers, the way they learn, it's like water, right? Water will always try to find its lowest level in the path of least resistance, right? So when young people are trying to do the research, they're just trying to do it quickly because they're trying to get it done, right? I see it right now with my son. He's in 5th grade. He's just learning some of these things. That's what he does. That's how he works. And so I'm trying to help him too. So we need to give them some of those tools, and working with the librarians will really help with that. And then once they know how to do that, then you can sort of turn them loose on the broader internet. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, John. And I think that might have addressed a second question from Larita. What are the best search spaces for students? But Larita, if you have any follow-up questions on that, please go ahead and add them to the chat. Another question we got is, are there any tutorials that help a teacher prepare a lesson on this information? And that question was asked when you were talking about logic checking and fact checking, but I think can be expanded to all of the concepts that you discussed today.
So I think what's interesting is that, we have the lesson on arguments and evidence that teaches about logical fallacies, but there are a number of websites out there that talk about rhetoric and logic. And I think that there are some resources out there that really help simplify, how arguments are structured, how claims are structured, and then how some of these logical fallacies work. I think there are some fun and engaging ways to do that. But the idea is, I think, where I would start is like, what is an argument, right? So, if I'm making a claim, right, how do I support that claim, right? So it's claim, and then what evidence am I using, and then how am I explaining the connection between my evidence and my claim, right? So I think the important starting point is like, what does a legitimate argument look like? What does a quality argument look like? With one where it can be evaluated based on claim, evidence, and the link between the two. So starting there is important. And so looking at argumentation and looking at that, and then understanding where that breaks down in terms of logical fallacies and false rhetoric.
Thanks, John. And we had a question, is this presentation available for teachers? So maybe in addition to the fact that we're going to be sending these slides out to Dr. Williams after the presentation today, John, you could talk a little bit about what other presentations and information are available for teachers online in video format.
Yeah, so we do have some recordings to previous professional development and professional learning on newslet.org and our Educator Network and Educator Resources. I will send a PDF of these slides that will be sent out. If you'd like the original PowerPoint file, it's very large to email, but if you want to try to get the original PowerPoint, you can send me an email, and I can arrange to share the file with you, and we can talk about how you can use it. I do see in the comment in the chat, somebody mentioned the Cpac stage design. If you saw the things that were happening at the Cpac conference that happened recently, there was some viral information going around about the shape of the stage and its relationship and similarity to a rune that had been used as a Nazi symbol. So the interesting thing about that is, like, there was a lot of discussion about that, and that's where I think there's an important conversation to be had about intent and sort of coincidence and similarities, right? So we can look at that stage and we see the shape of the stage, and I see the similarity to this other symbol, right? And there's a similarity there, but we can't just say, oh, look, they're using a Nazi symbol. What we really want to encourage young people to do is to go deeper, right? So does the shape of that stage change? Has it always been that shape? Is it something that's customizable? If it is customizable, who made the decision, right? Can we find out, how and why that shape was chosen? It's a big leap to say, look at the shape of the stage, look at this other symbol, these people are Nazis, right? That's a major leap in logic that we are reading into based on our own political viewpoints, right? We don't want to just jump directly to Nazis, right? That's a huge leap, and that's really problematic in a lot of ways, right? So we really want to encourage, and that's the problem with a lot of misinformation. It's very superficial. It's very sort of like, using a sledgehammer in a sense, right? We want to focus on really getting into asking questions like, what can we verify? And there's a lot of unanswered questions with that. So, we don't want to engage in confirmation bias in the sense that if I am politically liberal and I see this very conservative event happening, and I see this, oh, look at that shape, it's similar to this, yes, they're all Nazis. Like that, if I just make that leap, that's confirmation bias in action, and that's really problematic. So we really want to try to push past that and teach students to ask more questions. And it may turn out, like, we may find out that someone actually deliberately chose it. But the thing is, like, we just don't know for sure. So we have to like really ask, we have to ask bigger questions.
Great, thanks, John. I don't see any more questions for now. Okay,
just a couple, one really quick thing I want to mention. On June 3rd, we're having our next News Lit Camp. So this is a free day of professional learning. So this is a national News Lit Camp that we will be doing with the Wall Street Journal and perhaps a couple of other news organizations. So what this is, it's a day of professional learning focused on news literacy and journalism and current events. And the idea is that it's a combination of educators learning from journalists, but also some professional development similar to what we've been doing this morning with the News Literacy Project. It's meant to be a more interactive and engaging day. We will have a registration form available for that soon. So if you are connected to us on social media, you'll see from that. So if you might be available on June 3rd, please, save the date, and maybe you can join us for News Lit Camp. And then one last thing, I would just ask very quickly, if you might be able to take a few minutes, maybe if we're going into a break. We do have a survey that we ask educators. It's a very short survey. It should only take about 2 or 3 minutes. Your feedback is absolutely critical to the work that we do to make sure that we are providing engaging and effective professional learning. Obviously, these webinar formats are not ideal, but we're trying our best to make them informative and effective. So if you could please take a minute and complete that. And that comes to the end of my my part of the presentation. So I will hand it back over to Jordan. I'll stay online for a few minutes to see if there are some other questions that may pop up.
Great, thank you so much, John. So for those of us who are just joining, John just shared for an hour on the topic of what is news literacy, an introduction to news literacy education. And these slides will be available to you after the presentation for you to peruse again. If you haven't yet filled out the attendance form, please do so. We're going to paste the link here in the chat so that we can give you credit for being here today. And there is the attendance form. So with the next 20 minutes or so, what we'd like to do is address the question, how do we actually teach these concepts in the classroom? It's our job at NLP to provide you the resources with which to do this, and we're going to share just a few of them with you today. One moment while I start sharing my screen.
Could you put the link back up? I was about to take a picture of it. And you took it down for the survey.
There it is.
Okay, I got it. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I'm going to switch to sharing my screen. All right, so if you'd like to follow along today, you're welcome to. Right now I'm at newslit.org. And newslet.org is where you can find everything that we'll be talking about today, all the resources that we make for educators. So to access those from newslet.org, you click for educators on the top, and then you're brought to Newslet Nation. Newslet Nation is a brand new hub for our news literacy educator network. It's over 1,000 educators strong so far, but we hope to add many more, including you today. And on Newslet Nation, you'll find a video talking about what Newslet Nation is. And the first thing you'll see on the top here is a forum. In the forum, you can ask questions to others about how to teach specific concepts in news literacy, tips to use. You can ask for resources and share resources here. This is a great collaborative area for you to utilize in your spare time. We also have a question in the forum specifically for Birmingham educators. So feel free to take a moment to create your account. All you need to do is click the register button on the top right, and then post to the Birmingham post in the Newslet Nation forum. Here in Newslet Nation, you'll also find access to news literacy ambassadors. This is a new program, and there are 13 ambassadors throughout the United States who are excited to talk to you about your plans for implementing news literacy education in the classroom, as well as local opportunities for advocacy and for attending events, et cetera. So I believe your closest ambassador would be Dr. Stansel in Houston, and he is a great resource to reach out to with any questions. You can find his contact information here on the top left-hand side of his profile. In Newslet Nation, you'll also find an events section, and you should see that June 3rd Newslet Camp pop up here in the Newslet Nation events shortly. And if you click into an event, you can easily add it to your calendar, as well as learning a lot more about the event. And the main thing that we're going to focus on today in Newslet Nation is this Educator Tools section. So many of you have learned about Checkology. We'll talk about that here in a moment. You'll also find a resource library where you can explore resources that are made for many different grade levels and many different types of resources. Middle school educators might want to click on grades 4 through 6 or grades 7 through 9 to see what's available here. These are often one-off shareables and classroom activities that can be used from 1 to 3 class periods with students. And in addition to the resource library, we've got our educator newsletter, The Sift, information about our Informable app, and information about those newslet camps that John was talking about. So let's do a quick recap of the Checkology virtual classroom. Checkology is a browser-based e-learning platform that's available for free, and its core offering are 14 news literacy lessons, many of which John just briefly went over in his presentation. One great thing about Checkology is that it's easy to use both remotely and in person. We heard that you're this week going into teaching A block and B block with some students who are fully remote. And with a Checkology account, once you set up your class, you can use your Checkology teacher account to do these news literacy lessons in person with the students who are in your classroom. And then you can ask the students who are at home to do the lessons either synchronously on their own accounts or asynchronously. So Checkology will be really easy to use in this new environment that we're all dealing with. Another great thing about Checkology is that it is now available for you to add in your Clever library. So if you head to your Clever portal and you search for Checkology, you should be able to install it really quickly, and then it'll be available for students to join. So let's take a quick look at a Checkology account. This is a Checkology teacher account. When you create yours by just entering a few pieces of information on checkology.org, you'll be prompted to add a class. And when you do that, you'll just enter a few pieces of information. You'll send a join link to your students to join, and then you'll be able to assign them a course. And in a course, you'll have access to those 14 core news literacy lessons to assign to them, in addition to dozens of other supplementary activities. So you'll see some core lessons like the First Amendment, as well as some supplementary activities like InfoZone's school lunch. So InfoZone's school lunch asks students to zone pieces of information related to school lunch into one of 6 zones of information. And this is a great activity for middle schoolers. You can judge pieces of content and assignments on Checkology by hovering over the difficulty level, and you can learn a little bit more about them there. So I know in our previous Checkology sessions, we dived pretty deep into the 14 core lessons and how to assign them. So today I'd just like to emphasize a few additional features outside of students' main news literacy course. The first of which is the journalist directory. And if you click journalists on the top of your Checkology profile, you'll be brought to a listing of over 120 professional journalists who are excited to talk to you and your students on a variety of topics in news literacy. If you'd like to find somebody who is in your area, you can search by zip code. or you can filter by areas of expertise here on the right-hand side. So let's say I'm interested in my students learning more about how news judgment decisions are made or about misinformation. I'll click those two and click go. And then a list of journalists with that expertise will be displayed here. Once I click into a profile, I can learn more about that journalist's experience, about all of their areas of expertise, and I can take a look at their work. And then I can invite them to have a virtual conversation with me and my students. Once I send this invite, me and the journalist will coordinate our visit via email. And there are some supports that we offer to set up this journalist event. If you head to the Resources tab, and then to Teacher Supports, you will find a classroom connection planning sheet. And when you visit this will copy a Google Doc that you and the journalist can use to collaborate for preparing for your presentation beforehand. You can also contact NLP for assistance preparing for this journalist visit. So we recommend that if you plan on using Checkology this semester or next semester at all, that you go ahead and think about which journalists you might want to invite to speak to students and on which topics to really beef up their learning on a specific topic in news literacy. In addition to the journalist directory, something that I saw a lot of interest in the chat today was digital verification and fact-checking skills. And many resources about the skills that John talked about today can be found here in the Check Center. If you click Toolbox, the first section you'll see are tips. And these are things that we might take for granted, like using Control F to find a word on a web page. But students might not know about these. And these are great research skills that make students' work online a lot more efficient. And here under skills, you'll find tutorials led by NLP's education team on those digital verification skills like reverse image search, geolocation, critical observation, and more. And if you hover over the toolbox on the right-hand side, you'll have direct access to the tools that you can use to perform these skills. So you can use the Check Center in a variety of ways. You can ask students simply to head to the toolbox and watch a skills tutorial. You can assign them a fact-checking mission, which will prompt them to come here to the Check Center to reference these skills, or you can create your own activities using the Check Center. So I see a variety of ways that the Check Center can be used when you're teaching fact-checking or digital verification. In addition to the toolbox, the Check Center contains a quick check. This is like a widget that you can use to build habits of mind, to ask yourself questions about a piece of information that you find online. So here, if you have a specific piece of information, perhaps one that you saw on a social media feed, you can identify the type of information that you're working with. Let's say I have a meme, like a traditional meme that's an image with a text claim on it, one of those images with white text on the top and bottom. Then I'd click image or video with a claim. And then I would upload that meme, or I would link to it. And then I would be taken through a series of questions asking me, for example, whether or not I found that meme on a user-generated forum like Reddit or somewhere else. And then once I get to the end of the quick check, it will tell me whether the piece of information is likely true, likely false, or we just don't have enough information to decide. So that is just a quick overview of some of the extra features that are available on Checkology. Again, Checkology is totally browser-based, so all you need to use it is a tablet, laptop, or desktop with an up-to-date browser. It can be used remotely or in person, or a combination of the two, as y'all are working with, and it is totally free to use. So we recommend that you create an account either by heading to your Clever portal and adding Checkology there, or by heading directly to checkology.org and clicking register now on the top right-hand side. So I'm going to turn it over to Kim now, who will talk about a few more educator resources that are available to you.
Thanks, Jordan. And while I'm setting up my screen share, if anyone has any questions at this point, feel free to add those into the chat. Okay, so I have a couple of resources I wanted to share with you all. We've been talking a lot about some great news literacy concepts and skills, and these resources will help you integrate those into your classroom in a way that I think will help with things like bell ringers or exit tickets, or just integrating into curriculum wherever you see an opportunity. And the first one is through Flipgrid. We have a partnership page with Flipgrid, which, if you are new to Flipgrid, it's a video discussion experience. So you post a prompt to your students and students respond with video. And then they can have sort of a discussion across those videos that they've posted to the question that you've posed. So here's our educator, or our partnership page, excuse me, where you can see all of the prompts that we are posting regularly relating to news literacy. And here's our collections that we post. So each collection has a number of different prompts within it. Understanding Bias is our newest collection on Flipgrid. And an upcoming one within the next week or two will be on COVID-19 and vaccines. And we've talked a lot today with John about misinformation. We do have a collection on misinformation. And I'll just show you all a quick prompt to let you see what these look like. This prompt has an image here that has been doctored. It combines a mountain in Turkey with an eruption of a volcano in Chile. And the question asks students, what type of misinformation is this and how do you know? And when students are answering the question, they can click on this poster and see the 5 types of information to help them make their decision, and then post back their response in a video format. And Flipgrid does allow students to post comments and respond to one another. So it's a great way to facilitate discussion, especially when you're working with students who are learning from home, and you have in-person students. It's a great way to sort of engage everyone in a conversation. We also have an opportunity to take a look at some classroom-ready resources through the SIFT. We've mentioned the SIFT a couple of times today. It's News Literacy Project's free weekly newsletter for educators. And I wanted to take a moment to highlight a few of the features, some of which we've heard in today's session, like Ask a Journalist, but others that you may not be aware of. And so this way you'll know what to kind of look out for when you're going through the SIFT and seeing some of these features. News Goggles is one that's curated by Hannah and Susanna, 2 of our staff members that are former journalists. And they do a great job of doing a deep dive into news stories, helping put into context these news stories and giving some background information about the process that happens in a newsroom. They sometimes highlight things like excerpts in a news story or front pages or headlines, and they annotate those and create guided close readings. And these are usually classroom-ready materials that are in the form of slides, activities, and discussion questions. And they've covered quite a few topics so far, from sourcing to news versus opinion to credibility and hyperlinking. There's lots of topics already in the SIFT archives for you to choose from when you're looking for News Goggles classroom slides. But there's always new ones coming out, so be on the lookout for some News Goggles. We also have something called Viral Rumor Review, where we do guided analyses and fact-checking walkthroughs of timely viral rumors. John presented a few viral rumors today in his presentation. So if you're looking for similar ones that help highlight the ones that are current and spreading across the internet, working with your students to help debunk those and see why they are misinformation, why they're incorrect or misleading. This is a great feature to look out for. And these also come with some classroom ready slides. The most recent one on March 1st had 5 rumor reviews, including a Tom Cruise deep fake video, a doctored NASA photograph, and a faked Joe Biden tweet. The ones in the past have also focused on very specific viral rumors, like the one on February 8th. So there's some deep dive ones in our archives as well. And last, we've heard about this one, but I just want to highlight it again, the Ask a Journalist feature. So if you or your students have questions about news and journalism, be sure to submit that. You'll see the submission link in the SIFT and also in that Google Doc that we've been sharing with you all. And this is a great way to engage your students in asking those questions and then hopefully seeing those answered in an upcoming issue of the SIFT. So these are some great ways to sort of engage your students in news literacy with bell ringers, exit tickets, or embedding it into your curriculum. And I'm going to pass it back over to Jordan to see if there are any other questions and to wrap us up.
Excellent, thank you, Kim. So today we learned about what it means to be news literate. We took a look at Newslet Nation, which is where you'll find an educator forum as well as all of our resources. We took another quick look at Checkology, specifically the Check Center and the Journalist Directory, and we took a look at our weekly newsletter, the SIFT, and our Flipgrid resources. So we'd love to hear your questions. We do have one so far, which is there any way to assign the Checkology lessons in chunks as opposed to students having to move through the entire lesson at once? So the good news about Checkology lessons for students is that their progress will save throughout their usage of the lesson. So if you ask your students to only complete slides 1 through 10 of the info zones lesson, for example, they can do that. And when they click exit or they exit out of their browser, they'll be able to return and they'll be brought right back to slide 11. For next year, we are working on a way to make that even easier to do so that you can just push a button and students will know exactly where in the info zones lesson they should start again. But just to be super clear, the experience on info zones is the same for all students. So everyone to whom you assign info zones, for example, will have the same version of info zones.
I also recommend checking out Flipgrid, our partnership page on Flipgrid, and seeing if there are some chunks in there that you're interested in highlighting. Some of the Flipgrid prompts come directly from content in the lessons. And so it's a great way if you really want to highlight like a segment of a lesson to see if we have a prompt available on that.
An educator wrote to me and said that they have some experience with using just single chunks of lessons or assigning parts at once. So I'd like to open the opportunity for that person to unmute and speak about it if they'd like to. No pressure.
In Checkology, you can go through it and set up what you want. You don't have to use everything in there. You can set up your own. You can assign projects to them, and they can do it. I set it up with a lot of the Supreme Court cases when we were doing civics, and I just took it out of Checkology has whole programs for them to do, but you can pick out what you want to teach them.
Thank you for sharing that context. And I'll share a direct link here to our comprehensive lesson guides, which give not only background and tips for using lessons in the classroom, but copies of the transcripts and all of the assessments and the answers just on a separate page, so that if you would like to look at the content of a lesson outside of the actual structure of Checkology, you're welcome to do so. And if you need to adapt, like Dodie has, by selecting just portions of a lesson, you can do that by checking out the comprehensive lesson guides. All right, I'm putting that here in the chat. We have just a few more minutes. So today, before we leave, what I would love everyone to do, if you have a moment, is to sign up or subscribe to at least one of the resources that we talked about today. So that is Checkology, SIFT, Flipgrid. You don't necessarily have to sign up for, but you can check it out. But you can also sign up for Newslet Nation. So I've put those 3 in the chat. And if you have a moment, again, please sign up for one of those 3 so that we can make sure to keep in touch with you, and you'll get updates from us when we make updates to our various resources. All right, it looks like we don't have any questions coming in so far. We will stick around for the next 5 minutes or so. Dr. Williams, do you have anything you'd like to share here at the end of the session? Any instructions for us, takeaways, and information about what will be available to educators after the session today?
I just want to say thank you all for this great information and presentation. We definitely need our students to be smart consumers of information and critical thinkers. And based on the comments from both ELA and social studies, is very timely and needed, a needed skill for our students. And thank you all for also giving ways and ideas in which this can be infused into the lessons as bell ringers, or possibly adding to our resources within our pacing guides, our curriculum guides. And I just want to thank you all for your time today. And it's just been a really good presentation. And I even learned some things from John's presentation. So as soon as I get it from them, I'll make sure to send it out to you all as a resource that you might be able to post in Schoology, use for our asynchronous days, as we kind of help students. They're really doing a lot of virtual stuff right now. and over the past year with a lot of news information and social media information coming into them. So thank you so much for this this information and these resources. They're awesome. Thank you all.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today.
That's great to hear. Thank you so much for being here with us today and sharing your time. We really appreciate it. And we love hearing that we have some people in the chat saying they're signing up for Checkology. When you are checking it out and signing up for Checkology,